You know, it's my pleasure to introduce Lynn Lindsay. I mean, it's an awkward thing to start wearing these, but you know, as we think about living on a houseboat and all the things that could happen, accessories are important. So introducing Lynn today as day chair is a pleasure, and I'm going to do it quickly because we're a little bit behind. She's a graduate of UW Evans School of Business. She was for 13 years working for the city of Seattle, served as assistant director of Seattle City Center, right? Seattle, yeah, thank you, wow. And changed her career and to a 30-plus year wealth advisor. So she worked with Morgan Stanley until February 2014 when she retired. I can barely breathe, by the way. This is kind of on my... I'm realizing the synapses are slowing down. She keeps... That would be dramatic, Jim. She keeps busy in retirement a lot with Rotary. She's on the programs committee. She is an incoming trustee for the Seattle Rotary Service Foundation and also helps with our investment task force. So Lynn, thank you for all your work. She also has a bunch of other volunteer work with MOHI, with the Pacific Northwest Ballet, and in her spare time travels. And when I asked her what her favorite place to go is, she said, Paris, Paris, Paris. And I like that. Lynn, come to the stage and introduce our speakers.
As I begin to do the introduction to the program, I'm going to ask our three speakers to come up. I want to tell you the inspiration for this program came from the lady in the middle. Her name is Barb Graff. I call her the Mighty Mite, and you'll understand why I call her that when she speaks. She has a great deal of power in the city. She's the director of the Seattle Office of Emergency Management. And joining her will be John Vidali, who is the state seismologist. He's affiliated with the University of Washington, and he's received many national honors for his work in seismology, and he's currently planning an early warning system to save all of us from whatever the risky business is with the next big one. And we'll wrap with Matt Affleck, who is our Communications and Outreach Director for the City Office of Emergency Management. He'll share with you how you can become more prepared and help your families and communities also do so. By way of introduction, a little bit more about Barb. Barb actually has been with the city of Seattle since 2005. Prior to that, she served 21 years in a similar capacity at the city of Bellevue. And she's nationally recognized as one of the leaders in defining what an Office of Emergency Management is. It's a far cry from the old Civil Defense Office, which usually involved somebody who'd once been in some branch of the military, but it's much more integrated now, and I think you'll find it fascinating. With that, I'd like to bring up John Vidali, who will talk about earthquake risk and early warning. Then we'll hear Barb, regional planning and response, and the role of individuals in communications will be followed up with Matt. At the end, we should have time for a few questions. Please welcome John, Barb, and Matt. Thank you.
Okay, make sure I know how this works. Okay, and so in 10 minutes, this will just be a really quick cruise through the earthquake dangers here in Seattle, and also the latest tool, earthquake early warning, that we're developing. So I started with actually the most active seismic activity since I've been here. I've only been here 10 years, and the earthquakes have been pretty quiet, but we were pleased to discover Marshawn Lynch and his Beastquake a few years ago, and you can see the seismogram there. But, you know, seriously, the reason, of course, we have the seismic networks and all the worry about earthquakes is because the west coast of the U.S. is where the threat is concentrated. And just to put a dollar amount on it, just the damage in an earthquake in the Pacific Northwest is between $500 million and $1 billion a year in the long run. So most years, very little, but a few years, tremendous amounts of damage from the big earthquakes. That's the FEMA long-term expectation. And you know, I could talk for an hour about this, but basically we're at the plate tectonic boundary. We're at the place, as the cartoon shows, where the North American plate to the east is riding over the Juan de Fuca plate, which is hitting it from the west. And under our feet, about 50 miles, 30 miles down, is the boundary. You can see a dip from the trench offshore. down to the east, and that's where we have our biggest earthquakes. The surface outlined in red shows where the magnitude 9 earthquakes break about every 500 years. They break all the way from Vancouver Island down to California and move the ground about 10 yards on average. And so that's a danger we face. I'll talk about a little more in a second here. We also have earthquakes that come from the way the Juan de Fuca plate is sinking underneath us and bending and crumpling. Those are the magenta dots on that diagram. And there are faults right under our feet, shallow under the Puget Sound. Those are the yellow dots. And that's the third kind of earthquake, actually the worst kind for Seattle. So this map just indicates that these faults in the shallow crust are throughout the Puget Sound, and they're everywhere else too. We've just mapped the Puget Sound because that's where people live. And you can just tell by the names, the Olympia Fault, the Tacoma Fault, the Seattle Fault, the South Whidbey Island Fault goes up the east side of the Puget Sound. So these crustal faults are throughout this Puget Sound, but they move slowly. So they only have an earthquake every few thousand years that's very large on each one. And zooming in, to the Seattle Fault, it's one that doesn't come cleanly to the surface. We have a zone through South Seattle. You can see all those dotted lines on the map. And it runs basically from Bremerton through Puget Sound, Seattle, Bellevue, and Sammamish. And we know that 1,000 years ago, there was a magnitude roughly 7 to 7.5 earthquake that would be just devastating if it hit today. It's very fortunate those earthquakes are rare. In the right-hand frame is just an example of the landslides that might happen if this were to occur, and the worst case would be occurring in the rainy season when the ground's soft and heavy. So a terrible problem. And the most common kind of earthquakes, aren't the big ones on the coast or the big fault right under the city. They're the deep earthquakes like Nisqually, which happened here in 2001, and before that in 1949, 1965. And a dot on this map indicates there was one of these deep earthquakes in our catalog, and the 3 red dots are the big ones. And you can see that they can occur anywhere from Canada down to California, but they tend to happen right under the Puget Sound. This is kind of because of where the subducting slab is bending, and particularly the red dots right under the southern Puget Sound. So these are our most common threat, 80% chance of one of these in the next 50 years. The bigger one on the coast that we worry about, the magnitude 9, is one that actually has the best history pretty much of any fault in the world, because we can see the effects from the landslides offshore and the turbidites, we call them. And in the last 10,000 years, we know there have been 20 of these magnitude 9s along our coast. That's one every 500 years. We can actually look at the statistics and realize we're just a little bit more dangerous than average at the moment. 1 in 300 chance per year of having one of these earthquakes. So it's loaded up enough, even though it's only been 300 years since the last one. And there's another 20 magnitude 8s in southern Cascadia, but that's really southern Oregon and California's problem, not the Puget Sound. Lucky for us. And I'll just gloss over this. It shows on the left where the fault breaks, and on the right how the shaking is distributed. I'll just point out that the shaking reaches all the way to Hanford at a dangerous level, and we're in kind of the red zone, but we're not as bad off as the coast, which is just above where the most action is. Okay, so the second topic is early warning, and early warning is actually a very trivial concept. We just notice the ground shaking, estimate the earthquake that's happening, and tell people at the speed of light that there's some shaking coming their way at the speed of sound, basically. Speed of sound's a couple miles a second in rock. But of course, it's not that easy. But it's the technical problems are basically, we just need to invest and build the system. And I could go down the list of the reasons this is helpful. It doesn't eliminate the danger of earthquakes. It probably only cuts the danger by 10 to 50%, but since the danger is close to $1 billion a year, it's well worth taking these steps. We can slow down traffic in airplanes and trains. We can give hospitals and emergency operations a jump start before the communications are in turmoil. Companies can protect their equipment. Computer operations can go into safe mode, so you don't have to reconstruct what you thought you were doing when all the communications and computers quit. But most important, people can get some awareness and just know what's coming and take more thoughtful action. And a number of countries around the world are doing this. Japan's actually investing multiple billions of dollars. On the top line here, $16 million a year is what the system costs for the West Coast. We have about half the money through the USGS at the moment, and we think we'll get the full amount, but we have to keep pressing to make sure that we do. A simple example of why early warning is valuable are the trains. You can imagine these trains are expensive. Each one's about 30 million, but that's not the big reason. The big reason is at rush hour, there's 10,000 people moving close to 70 miles an hour on these trains. We'd like to protect them. And the third reason is that after an earthquake in the Bay Area, BART is might be one of the only ways to get around, because the roads are likely to be knocked out to a large extent. But we can go through a lot of details, but that's not what we have time to do. And actually a big benefit is just a little warning. People won't get glass in their feet, break their legs, sprain their ankles, and that's actually about half the cost of a lot of the earthquakes that we've had. So I think that's it. We've given the early warning system to emergency managers at about 40 organizations. We think in the fall we'll have the system working reliably enough that these emergency managers can start to think about how to use the warnings that we'll be generating. But we think it's a year or two before we can give the warnings to the public, because that takes education and that takes some way to get messages quickly through cell phones, which currently isn't possible on the timescales we need them. So just a remark, this is the last 25 years of earthquakes, so magnitude in the vertical axis, time on the horizontal axis. And before I came here, they promised me an earthquake a year. And you can see Nisqually, you can see the Klamath earthquake, the earthquakes near Portland. People remembered about earthquakes, and then Paul Bowden, network manager, and I arrived, and you can see that we haven't had an earthquake over magnitude 4.8 since we've been here. So, it's great to have this kind of luxury of building the system, but we also have to keep people remembering that the earthquake hiatus is temporary. So just, some of the key points I hope I made, there are a lot of different threats. We have a lot of uncertainty, just what's coming, size and extent and location. We love to do the science up here. The volcanoes and earthquakes are fascinating. The early warning system is important to finish. We're working on what do these big earthquakes do to the tall buildings in downtown. It's going to be long, weak shaking that the buildings weren't really designed for, and we're trying to quantify that problem. And actually, it was great talking at lunch with Barb, because the buildings in Seattle, some of those unreinforced masonry buildings, need some kind of action for the worst ones, and that hasn't happened yet in Seattle. So I think I'll quit there. I'll just mention, it's really fun being the regional seismologist. We get, every week it seems we get put on the spot about some issue or other. John Stewart grilling me about fracking. Actually, it was something, that's not exactly what happened, but it's just fun. So I'll turn it over to Barb, and if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them after we're through.
I always love following John, regardless of where we go. My name is Barb Graff. I'm the City of Seattle Emergency Management Director. We were talking around the table, sharing where were you in the Nisqually earthquake, and my story was that I was so fortunate. I was doing the same job for the City of Bellevue, and we were doing some critical incident stress training at Fire Station 10 in Bellevue, and I was flanked by 7 of the finest paramedics you'll ever meet. I can't tell you how great it is, in case we have the earthquake while I'm talking, that we've got Fire Chief Harold Scoggins right at the back of the room. That's where I'm heading after I get out from underneath my table. So John did a good job of describing what is one of the many hazards that we plan for here in Seattle. There's actually 18 different categories. We should offer Prozac along with showing you all the horrible nightmare scenarios that we think our way through. But we have to, because there's so much that we can do to get ourselves prepared. For those of you who may have caught Lucy Jones from the USGS being interviewed by Conan O'Brien recently, she compared, what's your chance of dying in an earthquake? And she said, oh, you have a much higher chance of being murdered in Los Angeles than dying in an earthquake, which some people didn't find comforting. So actually the analogy I use, you do stand a better chance of being struck by lightning and killed than you do in dying in an earthquake. So let's talk about how you survive the earthquake. Matt's gonna follow me in just a few minutes and talk about what your part of the city's plan is. More than 600,000 people live here. More than 120,000 are here during the day. We can't possibly, if we gave each of you a city worker, there's still one person or still one city worker for about 25,000 people. So you need to be a part of our plan, and you are. The city's Office of Emergency Management is a small group of people. Matt and I collectively represent 1/7 of it. There's 14 of us who plan for disasters, who train our community for it, who train city workers, who exercise and drill the things we put in our plans. We create mutual aid relationships. We're constantly studying disasters, not just ours, but other people's as well. Has anybody here ever been exposed to the New Yorker magazine article last July? The big one? Okay, so I owe her royalties. Catherine Schultz did a pretty good job of describing what is a really big earthquake like. Some inaccuracies, a few exaggerations, but for the most part, she got it right. So our job is to try and help convince the community if that's what things look like. If the escalator going downstairs doesn't work later today, if all of the electricity is off, if you don't have access to the grocery store or the pharmacy or the ATM, then what? The good news is we do this job in the Pacific Northwest, where we also have an awful lot of campers and pioneers and the kind of mentality that can get us through a disaster if we just take good action. So Matt will cover that part. Let me go back to describing a little bit what the city has done. We have taken this earthquake threat very, very seriously. John's been one of our partners for a long, long time. The city has seismically strengthened all of its fire stations. The city has reinforced all of its water reservoirs so we can actually get water out of those. We have built in flexible piping systems for where we might experience breaks. We bought the fire department with the levee, a brand new fireboat. Not new at this point, but we should replace that someday. We installed automatic natural gas shutoff valves at 35 of our most critical facilities, the breakout of fire being the highest danger following the shaking of an earthquake. We have trained all of our city staff in what their responsibilities are. And so there's not a single person in any department who doesn't have a specific job that they need to be doing in order to help respond to what the community's needs are. In emergency management, we do a lot more than plan. We also train on those plans, we educate the community, and we conduct exercises. So coming up just several weeks from now, you may have seen some media stories so far, you'll see more. There's a huge earthquake exercise that's coming not just to town, but to all of Western Washington called Cascadia Rising. John showed you where those plates are locked, about 50 miles off our coast. That doesn't just affect the Puget Sound. That affects everything from southern British Columbia to northern California. And if, like Sandy Doughton from the Seattle Times book is correct, and we get the full rip effect at the same time, it's all of Western Washington, all of Western Oregon, southern British Columbia, and northern California that need to be able to enact those plans that we've been working hard at putting into place. So in that exercise, it's an opportunity for local government, for state government, for federal government, for the Department of Defense and all their many assets to practice what does our coordinated response look like. Our coordinated response relies on as many people in our community to be as prepared as they can, because there will not, I promise you, there will not be enough to go around when it comes to emergency services. Matt's going to talk about how much food and water you ought to have. Whatever he says, double it. Because quite frankly, unless I can guarantee that we have raised our level of preparedness in this community, we've got way too many people who have been too complacent about this. So I'm urging everybody to act like you actually believe in the investments you make in REI and the Costco sizes of things that you store. Our community is so strong in so many different ways. A couple of good examples I want to give. Anybody here from United Way of King County? United Way of King County played an absolutely critical role for us. And I want to say this because our response is not all about government services. In the Aurora bus crash, and Chief, I've never seen a better mass casualty response in my entire life than what the fire department did that day. But in the days ensuing, all the wraparound services that needed to happen, we naturally become altruistic. We naturally want to give. Well, your government does a relatively good job at taking your taxes. We really don't want to take your donations. You don't want to mess your money up in our system. But United Way of King County now has a mutual aid or a memorandum of understanding. They're the agency we want to funnel donations to, so they in turn can help the Salvation Army, the Red Cross, and other people who are providing disaster services. As a result of our planning, there's a mutual aid relationship in place between every single assisted living care facility in all of King County and all of Pierce County. So instead of saying these 3 nursing homes have been damaged, we need to put the patient someplace else, we're not putting them on cots in a gymnasium. We're scouring all the bed capacity in all of King County and Pierce County to keep them in an undamaged facility where they can be given a greater level of care. So our whole job is to imagine your worst possible days, all the consequences that could happen, and how do we go about meeting the needs. I mentioned, we don't just study our own history though. The Nisqually earthquake, quite frankly, was a banker's earthquake. It was midweek, it was midday. There were no deaths directly related to the earthquake itself. There was a heart attack that might have happened that day anyhow. Injuries were relatively minor, lots of chimney damage, lots of unreinforced masonry damage, but we survived that relatively well. That's now in our memory as I do earthquakes. You don't do Seattle fault earthquakes or Cascadia earthquakes the same way the same way that we faced and got through Nisqually. So we need to believe this. If not for our own sake, if you're one of those people who says, I'm near retirement, it's not going to happen in my lifetime, it is going to happen in your kid's lifetime. It is going to happen in your grandkid's lifetime. It is going to happen in the history of Seattle. And Rotarians are notorious for your sense of responsibility. We need your voice in all of this preparedness to say, we believe it and we want our community to recover fast and efficiently and smart in ways that help take care of everybody's needs. So your Office of Emergency Management is hard at work studying highly depressing things, but trying to bring a sense of fun and joy to it nonetheless. Our whole mission is to build as many different partnerships and find as many resources as we can to link them to the very many needs that are going to exist the day of a disaster. And again, we practice this in exercises. We don't wait just to find out. We hope our plan works during a big disaster. The other thing we do is we invite people in from other areas. One of my favorite speakers was Mayor Bob Parker from Christchurch, New Zealand. So what happens when your downtown liquefies? And what happens when you have 1,000 aftershocks in your first 3 months? So we try and study what has worked and not worked in other places and apply that to our plans. We're hard at work, but our plans are worthless if you don't also do your part in preparedness. So be a part of the team. We've already written you into the plans as being prepared. I'd like to introduce Matt Offlick, who's going to tell you how you personally can go about doing that.
All right, thank you. So I'm Matt Offlick. I'm the Public Education Coordinator for the Office of Emergency Management. First, I just want to say, wherever the gentleman is, how much I appreciate the earthquake jokes, earthquake Twitter jokes. So I can tell you, my job, going out there, talking to people about preparedness, I think the biggest challenge is engaging them in the conversation, having it be something that they want to talk about. So we've actually been doing some events lately, a series with Central Cinema that's on 21st Avenue. They do a thing on Thursdays, Heckle Vision, where they show a bad movie and your text messages go up onto the screen. So we've been doing disaster in a movie, and that's what that reminded me of. We did Sharknado in March. I'm lucky enough to get to award the best heckler. And that day I awarded it to a person whose name was Trump for President, and they said, when I become president, I'm going to build a wall to keep the sharks out and make the sharks pay for it. So so I appreciate the earthquake jokes. I also appreciated the conversation that we kind of had at the table at the beginning. You know, we had those cards, talked about where we were during the Nisqually earthquake. So I'm a relatively recent transplant from the East Coast, so I wasn't here in 2001, moved here in 2013. But there was another event that year that really kind of influenced my getting into this field and kind of how I look at preparedness. And so graduated from high school in June of 2001 in Western New York, moved to New York City end of August to attend John Jay College, which is a city university in New York. So I lived in Brooklyn, went to school in Manhattan, was doing that for about 2 weeks. I would take the Q train from Brooklyn up to 59th and 10th. And so then 2 weeks into that, that was kind of thrown a little bit because 9/11 happened. So I think I was on the Q train little after 8:30, right when the planes hit the towers. They stopped the train maybe a block before my normal stop. Things didn't travel that fast in terms of communication even 15 years ago, so wasn't a lot of information about what's happening. Just got off the train, walked to school, maybe 20 minutes later start seeing the news, finding out what happened. And really saw someone I knew. We realized transportation was down, communication was down, and just kind of talked about what we're going to do. Whenever I go to a new place, I make it a point to really spatially know where I'm at. So I took the train every day, but I also knew other ways to get home. And we kind of had the conversation, and we walked home. It was 5 miles, and it took a long time, but that's what we did. And that sounds like a simple thing, but I think the conversations we have a lot in the community, it's things like that that really kind of throw people off. It's kind of overwhelming. But that sums up kind of how I think about preparedness. So I think about preparedness really as confidence. I was 18, so I could have just been stupid and naive, but I'm going to stick with the fact that I was confident, and that's what it was. Just had an idea of what I needed to do and did it. So one thing, you know, when we talk about where that confidence comes from, to me, the first thing is knowing what those risks are and what the potential impacts are. John talked about some of those, Barb talked about some of those. We already referenced the New Yorker article. So it was good for business for us because it got people interested. Unfortunately, a lot of times it's just that fear that gets them interested. So one thing about the New Yorker article is 8 days later, she came out with another article which was really focused on what are the things you can do to prepare. We heard a lot about the article as we went out and did programming after, and my anecdotal evidence tells me that about 10 million people read the first one and maybe 7 read the second one. So people really focused on what are the things that are going to happen, but that follow-up piece was really those action items people didn't necessarily latch onto. So in terms of knowing what's going to happen, something that came out of that for us is we did a lot of programming in the community. We found that when we brought out hazard maps, when people really looked at maps and where those risks are in relation to where they live, they engaged a lot more in conversation with us about preparedness. So the challenge is combining those 2 articles that she did into one, not just what's going to happen, but what are you going to do about it? So our Seattle Hazard Explorer we came out with the end of last year, and this really seeks to do that. It takes a lot of our hazard data, which normally sits in a 300-page document that if you wanted to, you could access on our website, but it probably wouldn't be the most kind of invigorating read for you. But this really puts a lot of that at your fingertips. Look at the map, see what those things are. You know, are you in a liquefaction zone? Are you in an area that's prone to landslides? We mentioned unreinforced masonry buildings. We have about, right now, 1,164 is the official number. So, you know, looking at a map and seeing, are these things going to impact you where you're living, where you're working? And then the challenge is connecting that to actual preparedness actions. So this lets us put a lot of that information in there that you can access. So not only are you in a URM, but if you're in a URM, what are some things that you can do about it? And so what are those things you can do about it? You know, when we're out there, Barb did a good job of articulating that we're doing a lot of planning at the city level for how government is going to respond, how a lot of the organizations out there are going to respond. But there's only a finite capacity, and we're really relying on people to be prepared themselves so that we can really focus those efforts on the people that are most in need. And so we really look at the whole community, and that really starts with the individual. So your confidence as an individual, your preparedness level as an individual is really going to influence how you can then support those around you, your family, your neighborhood, your workplace. So at the individual level, you know, it's really focusing on those things like the 9/11 example I just gave. If there's no transportation all of a sudden, if there's no communication, how are you going to get back in contact with family? How are you going to reunite? How are you going to get the things done that you normally get done? And then those things that you can do beforehand. We mentioned the unreinforced masonry buildings, but also in Seattle, a lot of our housing stock is older. So we offer classes on home retrofitting that we do at the Department of Construction and Inspections. A lot of the homes that we have here are not secured to the foundation, especially if they were built before 1980. And so those are things you can do beforehand. Are there things that you can do to make your home safer, structurally and non-structurally? You know, securing cabinets, securing heavy furniture, those types of things. In our office, all of us staff, all 14, like Barb mentioned, many of us, so we do rotations as staff duty officer, where we're on a 24-hour on-call. We'll do it for a week at a time, and we're really the point person for emergency management if there's some coordination needed in the city. And as we've been bringing on new staff, we did a survey recently just to find out, okay, as staff that serve in this role, how comfortable are you with the different duties that might come up in that role? And we posed the question of, how comfortable are you doing this if you got the call and it was just you and you had to do all these things? And then we also posed, what if you were working with a team and you had support from other people in the office? And not surprisingly, it was drastically, if you were doing it with a team, people were much more comfortable doing it. They were much more confident doing it. And the same thing applies here when we're preparing in the community. You can do things as an individual, but if you have those connections with neighbors, you're going to be much better able to respond. So we have these kind of concentric circles. Neighborhood preparedness, we have our SNAP program, which is Seattle Neighborhoods Actively Prepare, and that really focuses on that block level response. So after an earthquake happens, there's certain things that we know are going to happen. There's going to be fires. We're going to need to control utilities in homes. There's going to be some first aid care that's going to need to be done on the block. So how, as a block, can you organize, prepare beforehand so that you can do those things? That's kind of that neighborhood level. And then after that neighborhood response, you have those immediate threats kind of taken care of. We really look at then the larger neighborhood. So our community emergency hubs, we have 53 of those right now in the city. Now that's another place where those blocks can congregate, start sharing information, sharing resources, so as a neighborhood you're able to respond. So, that's really the whole community approach, is that it's not just individuals, but blocks, neighborhoods. And beyond that, so in terms of reaching the whole community, we have a lot of audiences to reach. It's not all individuals, it's not all families. Last year we reached about 13,000 people. That was really a spike, probably a lot of it thanks to the New Yorker article. Like Barb said, I think she sent a thank you to Catherine Schultz because she really drummed up business for us, which was good. Reaching the most vulnerable populations is something that's always a challenge. We know from events like Katrina that people who are, low-income families, non-English speakers, the elderly, these people are often going to be impacted more from disasters. Last year, we started our Community Safety Ambassador program, where we have members of the community that represent these groups, 25 community safety ambassadors, many of them that speak some of the top-tier languages in the city, other than English, and we train them to go deliver preparedness messaging to their communities, so it's coming from people that they know and not from us. Other things, community-based organizations. So a big topic in the city right now, for example, is homelessness. We know that we have over 3,000 people that may be experiencing homelessness on any given day. Those are people that have hundreds of organizations out there supporting them every day. After that big earthquake, there's going to be thousands more people who suddenly need services that they didn't need previously. And so it's important that those community-based organizations can continue to serve those people that they do on a regular basis. So we're out there working with those organizations on how they develop plans so that they can keep doing that. And the same goes with child care centers and schools. We have about 660,000 people in the city, about 15%, so 100,000 are under the age of 18. So on any given day, a lot of those folks are in school, they're in child care centers. So really working with them so they have appropriate plans. So schools and child care centers can reunite families after disaster, that they can have things in place to take care of the people that they're responsible for. And then businesses. So long-term recovery, how we recover as a region, business is going to be critical in that. So it's just another audience that we always have to reach, how they're preparing, and so that they can really aid in that longer recovery process. And the last thing I would mention, and there's some flyers outside, is, I started talking about the confidence starting with understanding the impacts, understanding what might happen. Kind of the last thing is when something actually happens, are you getting information? And so Alert Seattle is the city's new emergency notification system, which we launched in August of last year. You can sign up at alert.seattle.gov, and that's one way that you can be sure that you're going to be getting that most critical information when something happens in terms of what are those actions that you need to be taking. So I would urge you to sign up for Alert Seattle. Like I said, there's some brochures outside. Thank you very much.
We have time for about 2 questions.
So make them good.
Question here from Jeff. Thanks for joining us today. I think we all know the Alaska Way Viaduct isn't long for this world, regardless of the quake. But can you inform us a bit about how the tunnel is going to be affected and what went into the planning on that to try and make it survivable?
It's a longer answer than a 60-second response. What I can say is that safety engineers throughout many city departments have been working with WashDOT on the design of that tunnel. And of course, we took into account the fact that we are in earthquake country, we do have liquefaction areas, we do experience flooding, et cetera. So I can say that the many departments who have any kind of safety responsibility have helped in the design. If you'd like more information, I'll give you my card and I'll follow up.
Barb, thank you so much. So for those of us we are making our lives here in the Pacific Northwest region, I'm going to ask a really just personal question because it's something on my mind right now. A young son, we're about to look for a home. What are the kinds of questions I should be asking about the kind of land that my house stands on, the kind of way it's been built or retrofitted so that we have the best chance of protecting ourselves in our family spaces when we are considering moving to new dwellings?
Great question. Start with Matt's map. And it will show you where is there flooding potential, where is there's liquefaction susceptibility, age of homes and things like that. I would start by talking with your real estate agent about, I want to know a lot about the house, the age, and therefore you can link it to a building code, and therefore what seismic code was it built to. One of the most important things here in Seattle is we have so many beautiful old homes that back then in that building code wasn't required by code to be attached to the foundation. We teach classes in that, and we teach contractors in that. Finney Neighborhood Association in Lakewood offer you the tools through a tool lending library to do that. But ask your real estate agent specifically, how is this home when it comes to flooding and earthquake? That's what I would do. How many people have earthquake insurance, by the way? Fantastic. You have outdone yourselves when it comes to the statewide average. I own it myself. I highly recommend it. Life preserver.
Right, exactly. Thank you all so much. Lynn, thank you for pulling this together. Your program expertise shines. And John, Barb, and Matt, I don't know about anybody else in this room, but I personally feel so much more peaceful knowing you are at the helm. My longtime voice coach, Awilda Verdejo, is a spirited Puerto Rican, Juilliard-trained opera singer who marked her 70th birthday by walking El Camino. What makes Awilda a powerful teacher is her own willingness to be a student. She has taught me that as we get older, our bodies demand more practice, not less. Mastery is not fewer mistakes, it is returning more quickly. Our rigidity creates distance, while vulnerability fosters connection. Preparing makes us feel in control. Preparedness allows us to release it. See you next week.